Hello everyone, Dark of All Trades here. Now there are a lot of arguments in apologetics. Some are better than others, but every single one of them is not without flaw. I make it a habit of showing those flaws. That being said, today's video comes from a smaller channel called The Principles of Indoctrination. I wonder just how apt that name is going to be. But I, of course, want to give this video a fair chance. It is titled, Christian Arguments Atheists Can't Refute. Well, I have refuted quite a few arguments before, and I've made videos on several of them, and plan to make more, but I am always up for a challenge. So let's see what arguments the P of Indoctrination thinks atheists can't refute.
Only heaven silence for an answer.
You do know that Pascal's wager paints a pretty grim picture when comparing Christianity versus atheism.
So I forgot to mention, he puts this really annoying scene at the end of each of his arguments, so you don't have to listen to it, I'm just going to cut it out from here on out. I did a bit of looking in his comments section before I started this, and it seems that he wanted to emphasize that he is only comparing the false dichotomy of Christianity versus atheism. So not quite Pascal's wager, but close. I already did a video with a full breakdown of Pascal's wager and why it isn't a good argument against atheism or for a god. What is often missed is that it isn't about whether a god exists or not, but it's about whether or not someone should believe by a certain viewpoint. It ignores every other god and the vast interpretations of the Christian God. It assumes that belief in the specific God is a relevant criterion, and not other criteria such as maybe this God cares about whether we're using the brains he gave us honestly and did our best to come to what conclusions made sense to us. Maybe the criteria was people who don't believe based on faith and don't accept what other men just tell them and come to their own conclusions. So first, this commits a false dichotomy fallacy. He's only presenting two options when countless others exist. Even within Christianity, there are thousands of denominations with conflicting requirements for salvation. So which version is correct? Second, it assumes belief is a choice rather than a conclusion based on evidence. Most atheists aren't choosing disbelief. They're unable to believe without sufficient evidence. This makes the wager meaningless since one cannot simply choose to believe as a hedge against risk. Third, it presumes to know the mind of God. What if God values intellectual honesty over professed belief? What if God prefers those who use reason and evidence rather than faith? What if God rewards those who reject insufficient evidence rather than those who believe out of fear of punishment? So very briefly, the argument commits several logical fallacies. There's an appeal to consequences, believing because the potential negative outcomes. There's special pleading, why only consider the Christian God? There's a false dichotomy, presenting only those two options. And begging the question, it assumes God's criteria for judgment. So like I said, this version is actually weaker than Pascal's original wager because it doesn't even attempt to account for other religions or belief systems, ignoring all of the other potential positions in order to try to limit the discussion. It's an argument designed to exploit fear rather than arrive at the truth.
Despite any argument ever heard, there is no way for an atheist to have or possess objective morality. Objective has to come from something outside of you, or else it's subjective.
While he isn't explicitly saying it, he is implying so hard that I can feel it. Only God gives objective morality, which fails both logically and practically. So let's look at why. First, I don't want to go into this too much as there are plenty of videos on it, but consider the classic Euthyphro dilemma. If something is moral because God commands it, then morality is arbitrary. If God commands it because it's moral, then morality exists independently of God. What he seems to be missing is that we already use objective moral reasoning daily. When we say generally harming children is wrong, we can support this with evidence about harm, well-being, and social cohesion. No supernatural foundation is needed. Secular frameworks like utilitarianism provide systematic approaches to moral decisions. His argument here misunderstands objective versus subjective. We start with subjective values, in most cases human well-being matters, and derive objective conclusions, therefore it tends to be actions that maximize well-being are moral. This works like mathematics. We begin with axioms and build logical frameworks. Even religious morality requires human judgment. When religious texts appear to condone slavery or violence, believers use their own moral reasoning to interpret or reject those passages. This shows we already have moral foundations beyond divine command. And more importantly, claiming morality requires God doesn't solve anything. It just moves the question. We still need reasons why this specific God's commands constitute morality rather than any other standard.
You do realize that nothing never creates something, no matter how many people with degrees say it does somehow.
I see this argument a lot more than I should. So first, let me address a big point. That is, what is meant by nothing? Philosophically, nothing is often defined as the complete absence of space, time, matter, and energy, a state that, to the best of our knowledge, has never been observed or tested. Because we have no empirical experience with nothing, we can't make definitive claims about its properties. This makes the assertion that nothing never creates something unsubstantiated. If nothing truly has no properties, it also has no constraints, meaning we can't rule out the possibility that it might give rise to something. Second, the claim commits the fallacy of begging the question, assuming as a premise that nothing cannot create something. Here, he's not offering any evidence for this claim, and instead, he assumes it as a starting point. This circular reasoning is particularly problematic because it fails to engage with alternative perspectives or evidence. Third, modern physics challenges the simplicity of this argument. The quantum vacuum, though not nothing in the purest sense, is a state with no particles but fluctuating energy. Under certain conditions, particles can arise spontaneously as demonstrated by quantum field theory. While this doesn't directly explain the origins of the universe, it shows that the relationship between nothing and something is far more nuanced than this argument allows. Finally, and arguably most egregious, he dismisses scientific expertise with the phrase, "no matter how many people with degrees." This is not just dismissive, it's anti-intellectual. Cosmologists and physicists who study these topics dedicate their careers to understanding these profound questions. While expertise isn't infallible, it is far more reliable than rhetorical assertions from someone who hasn't engaged with the evidence. Rejecting expert consensus without engaging with the reasoning behind it reflects confirmation bias, starting with a conclusion and dismissing anything that challenges it. His point ultimately fails to address the complexity of the issue. He makes unsupported assumptions about the nature of nothing, misrepresents the current state of scientific understanding, and relies on dismissive rhetoric rather than evidence. If we're to have meaningful conversations about topics like this, they need to be rooted in curiosity and respect for expertise, and a willingness to follow the evidence where it leads, even when it challenges our preconceived beliefs.
You know, it's been over 150 years since Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, and they haven't actually found one verifiable evidence that confirms evolution.
So the claim that there's no verifiable evidence for evolution is one of the most easily debunked arguments against it. To say this, he must either misunderstand what evolution is or be willfully ignorant of the massive body of evidence that supports it. So let me break it down step by step. First, it's important to clarify what evolution is. Evolution is the change in the genetic makeup of populations over time, a process that we observe directly. So some examples may include bacteria developing antibiotic resistance, which is evolution in action, and changes in species like Darwin's finches, which adapt to environmental pressures. These are observable facts. The theory of evolution by natural selection, on the other hand, is the scientific explanation for how evolution happens. It's like understanding gravity. We observe objects falling, and the theory of gravity explains why. So what counts as verifiable evidence? Well, evolution is supported by diverse and independent fields of science. Here are just a few. Transitional forms like Tiktaalik show the gradual shift from fish to land-dwelling vertebrates. Shared DNA markers between species point to common ancestry, such as humans sharing 98% of our genome with chimpanzees. Similarly, the embryos across species reflect evolutionary relationship. And new species have been observed forming, such as plants and insects. This evidence has been rigorously tested and verified over those 150 years. Dismissing it outright ignores how science works, through observation, replication, and refinement. Finally, it's important that I address a common misunderstanding about scientific theories. In science, a theory isn't just a guess. It's a framework for understanding facts. The theory of evolution by natural selection is as well supported, if not better, as the theory of gravity or germ theory in medicine. So his argument tends to rely on moving the goalposts. Critics demand fossils showing halfway transitions, which misunderstand gradual evolutionary change. Every fossil is a transitional form, capturing one stage in a continuum. The evidence for evolution is overwhelming. Rejecting this means he either has a gross misunderstanding of science or an unwillingness to engage with the data. With science, we're encouraged to explore and question, but it requires us also to follow the evidence where it leads.
You do realize there's never been a true undisputed transitional fossil. And even if you could possibly shoehorn one transitional fossil and try to make it work, you would need millions, if not more, to actually substantiate Darwin's claims. It's really simple. Life never comes from non-life.
The phrase, "do you realize," seems to be a recurring rhetorical tactic in this video. It sets a condescending tone and implies that the position is so obvious that anyone disagreeing it must be either ignorant or unreasonable. This approach doesn't invite thoughtful discussion, it shuts it down. In this case, he's using his claims as though they were self-evident. However, every time he does this, there are always significant issues with his claim. So for this one, the claim is that there's never been a true undisputed transitional fossil, which misunderstands both the nature of science and the evidence for evolution. So let me break it down. First, what exactly are transitional fossils? Well, they're fossils that show intermediate traits between ancestral and descendant species. They aren't halfway forms in the cartoonish sense, but rather snapshots that illustrate gradual changes over time. Like I said before, Tiktaalik isn't a classic transitional fossil, bridging the gap between fish and tetrapods with features like fin structures capable of bearing weight. So let's look at some other examples. Archaeopteryx has traits of both dinosaurs and birds. Australopithecus afarensis, a hominin with both ape-like and human-like characteristics. And whale evolution fossils such as Pakicetus and Ambulocetus show the shift from land mammals to aquatic life. Claiming that these are not true transitional fossils may be a no true Scotsman fallacy, dismissing any example presented by redefining what counts as true evidence. If the criteria for transitional fossils keeps shifting, no evidence will ever be deemed sufficient. Second, the use of the word undisputed is a distraction. Science thrives on skepticism and debate. Evidence is continuously tested and refined. But disagreement doesn't mean invalidation. To illustrate, I could argue that there are no undisputed God concepts. Would he now conclude that gods don't exist? Well, of course not. Disagreement is part of the process, not a reason to dismiss evidence outright. Third, I'm not so sure about his claim about needing millions of transitional fossils. Fossils are rare because fossilization requires specific conditions, yet we have an impressive array of transitional forms. Let's take a look at a few examples. The horse lineage from Hyracotherium to modern horses show gradual changes in teeth, size, and limbs. The evolution of modern birds from theropod dinosaurs, with fossils such as Microraptor and Velociraptor exhibiting feathers. These fossils provide more than enough evidence to substantiate Darwin's claims. Finally, the pivot to abiogenesis, life never comes from non-life, is a separate issue entirely. Evolution explains how life changes over time, and not how it began. Abiogenesis is an active area of research with promising hypotheses exploring how simple organic molecules could assemble into self-replicating systems. The assertion that life required a deity is an unsubstantiated leap. If he's claiming that his God created life, he bears the burden of proof to demonstrate why this is more plausible than natural processes or other possibilities. Without evidence, his claim holds no more weight than saying life was created by aliens or an unknown force. This argument ultimately fails because it misunderstands the nature of transitional fossils, conflates evolution with abiogenesis, and relies on logical fallacies to dismiss evidence. Again, science invites us to question and test claims, but it also requires us to engage honestly with the data. The evidence for evolution is clear, abundant, and independently verified across multiple scientific fields.
You do realize while Charles Darwin had made his stupid book, The Origin of Species, and everyone was going hog wild over it, that almost in the exact same year, Louis Pasteur was doing actual science and proved that life does not come from non-life.
This whole idea misrepresents both the historical reception of Darwin's work and the nature of Pasteur's experiments. Let me break it down. So when Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859, the response was far from universal acclaim. While the book was revolutionary, its reception was mixed. Among scientists, it initiated fierce debates. Many accepted the concept of evolution but were skeptical of the nature of selection as the primary mechanism, and some viewed it as incomplete without more evidence, such as the genetic mechanisms that weren't understood until Mendel's work was rediscovered decades later. The general public was divided. In religious circles, particularly among Christian clergy, the idea challenged traditional creationist views and biblical literalism, leading to widespread controversy. Over time, as evidence from genetics, paleontology, and other fields accumulated, Darwin's theory became the cornerstone of modern biology. But the journey to broad acceptance was neither immediate nor without significant opposition. So the claim that everyone was going hog wild over Darwin's book oversimplifies and exaggerates its reception. But Louis Pasteur, working in the 1860s, famously disproved the idea of spontaneous generation. Through meticulous experiments such as boiling broth in swan neck flasks to prevent contamination, Pasteur demonstrated that microorganisms arise from existing microorganisms, not spontaneously from non-living material. However, this has nothing to do with abiogenesis, the study of how life could have originated on prebiotic Earth billions of years ago. Pasteur's work only addressed whether life could spontaneously appear under everyday modern conditions. Abiogenesis, on the other hand, involves understanding how non-living chemical compounds might have assembled into the first self-replicating molecules, eventually leading to life. So the claim that Pasteur proved life does not come from non-life conflates spontaneous generation with abiogenesis, two entirely separate issues. So his framing here suggests that Pasteur's work somehow invalidates Darwin's. This is pretty misleading for a couple of reasons. Darwin's theory of evolution explains how life changes over time. It does not address the origin of life. Pasteur's work dealt with microbiology and the origins of microorganisms in modern contexts. These scientific contributions are not in opposition to one another. Both Darwin and Pasteur made landmark contributions to their fields, and the advancement of one does not diminish the importance of the other. Here his argument relies on several logical fallacies. First, he's pointing out a straw man. He's misrepresenting Pasteur's work to claim it disproves abiogenesis. He's making a false comparison, framing Darwin and Pasteur's work as competing ideas when they address entirely different questions. And he's using an appeal to emotion by using dismissive language like stupid book to attack Darwin's work rather than engaging with its content. In science, it's not about putting one figure against another. It's about how their work contributes to our broader understanding of the natural world. So Darwin and Pasteur's contributions are not in conflict, and misrepresenting their work to discredit one or the other undermines the spirit of scientific inquiry.
You do realize that just because you can make an excuse for something doesn't mean you've proved that it's untrue, right?
The statement, just because you can make an excuse for something doesn't mean you've proved that it's untrue, cuts both ways. If we apply this logic consistently, it undermines not only scientific explanations, but also his own arguments about the Bible and apologetics. I could dismiss his defense of biblical inerrancy or theological claims as mere excuses, but doing so without engaging with the evidence would be unfair and unproductive. The point of evidence-based reasoning is to evaluate explanations on their merit, not to dismiss them outright because they challenge our beliefs. If he's dismissing well-supported scientific or philosophical explanations as excuses simply because they conflict with his current views, then there's no meaningful engagement with the evidence. At that point, there isn't much more he can add to the discussion.
Do you realize that intelligence doesn't just arise from matter? Like, if you think about it, as humans, we wouldn't even know our own names if somebody didn't tell us. Intelligence comes from an intelligent being.
His claim that intelligence doesn't just arise from matter assumes a great deal of things without providing any evidence. Let me look at this more closely. So first, can intelligence arise from matter? Well, neuroscience strongly supports the idea that intelligence is an emergent property of the brain, a complex organ made of matter. While there is still a lot we don't know or understand about consciousness, there is no scientific evidence that intelligence requires an external pre-existing intelligent being. Here he's not providing any justification for the claim, He's just making an assertion rather than an argument. Second, his point about needing someone to tell us our own names seems unrelated to the origin of intelligence. Names are simply labels, sounds we assign to ourselves. You can create your own name, change it, or even exist without one. If the argument is that humans learn language and knowledge from others, then that's true, but it doesn't address how intelligence itself arose. Social learning is a feature of intelligence, not its origin. Third, the assertion that intelligence comes from an intelligent being is circular reasoning. If intelligence requires intelligence to exist, where did the first intelligence come from? This leads to an infinite regress unless he assumes an uncaused intelligent being, such as his God. However, this assumption is unsupported by evidence and doesn't explain how intelligence arose from simpler systems, like the gradual evolution of nervous systems. And something that I need to note that he missed is that intelligence didn't appear fully formed. Evolutionary biology shows that intelligence developed gradually over billions of years through natural processes. Early nervous systems in simple organisms evolved into more complex brains capable of higher reasoning. This natural progression doesn't require a supernatural explanation. Once again, his argument conflates several ideas: abiogenesis, the emergence of intelligence, and social learning, without addressing any of them. Intelligence is a fun topic, but its origins are best explained by science, not unsupported assertions.
Don't get me started on the whole love category. We're not just a whole bunch of hormones and whatever trying to spread our seed and be as fertile and pick the right mate and all this crazy stuff. Love and romance actually exist. Real love and real romance, not some hormone chemically driven heat cycle.
The argument about love being real and distinct from hormones and whatever relies heavily on an appeal to emotion. While love feels profound and special to us as individuals, this doesn't mean it requires a supernatural explanation. So first, let's consider what love is from a scientific perspective. Love is a term we use to describe a range of brain states and emotions, influenced by neurochemical processes such as the release of oxytocin, associated with bonding, and dopamine linked to pleasure. These processes create feelings of attachment, connection, and joy, which are crucial for forming relationships. Just because these feelings arise from biochemical mechanisms doesn't make them any less real. All emotions, joy, sadness, fear, are rooted in brain chemistry, yet their significance in our lives remains undeniable. Second, his dismissal of love as being chemically driven ignores the evolutionary significance. Love and attachment evolved because they provide clear survival advantages. Pair bonding and cooperative parenting, for example, increase the likelihood of offspring survival, while feelings of connection and trust foster social cohesion. These evolutionary roots don't detract from the personal meaning of love. They highlight how deeply embedded it is in our nature as humans. Finally, why is love so often highlighted in these arguments? Every time this argument is made, they invoke love. But this could be because love evokes a deep emotional resonance, making it an effective rhetorical tool. He might be using an appeal to emotion to frame love as something so special it must require a supernatural explanation. But this framing doesn't hold up under scrutiny. If love requires a divine source, why don't we make the same argument for other emotions like fear or anger? If the claim is that love cannot be explained by natural processes, then he adopts a burden of proof to show why this is true. Without evidence, his argument leans on sentiment rather than substance. Love, like all emotions, is a complex and deeply meaningful human experience, but one that is best understood through the lens of science and reason.
And you do realize that atheism is like a big fat lie that everyone has to prop up with excuses and more lies. That's why they're turning to panspermia. Aliens did it, and things like that.
He sounds so bothered by the whole idea of atheism. It comes off very much like, methinks he doth protest too much. Without evidence to demonstrate how atheism is a lie, this is just an empty assertion. Anyone could make the exact same statement, replacing atheism with anything to be just as valid. Alternative ideas to your own, whether atheistic or theistic, are not excuses and lies simply because they differ from your own beliefs. Using this logic, one could easily claim theism is like a big fat lie, and that's why theists turn to excuses like Christianity and things like that. This approach doesn't engage with the reasoning or the evidence behind either position. It just dismisses them outright. If he really wants to challenge atheism meaningfully, whatever that actually means, or really any position he doesn't agree with, he should address the arguments and evidence supporting it rather than relying on dismissive rhetoric.
You do realize that the Bible has never been proven untrue, despite all the attacks for a couple thousand years now. You do realize that from Genesis to Revelations, it's been proven true time and time again. No matter how many conspiracy theories you gather or how much you listen to Bart Ehrman, it's still true.
He really thinks that the Bible has never been proven untrue, huh? Come on, many stories and claims of the Bible have been shown to be historically or scientifically inaccurate. Here are just a few examples. Genetic research demonstrates that humanity did not originate from a single pair of humans. Instead, humans evolved as a population of thousands. There's no archaeological evidence for Moses' existence or for millions of Israelites wandering the desert for 40 years. Geological evidence shows no global flood as described in Genesis. Local floods, such as those in Mesopotamia, may have inspired the story, but a worldwide flood is impossible. In my field, linguistics disproves the notion that all languages stem from a single event of confusion. Finally, archaeology suggests that Jericho's walls fell long before the biblical timeline for the Israelite conquest. Additionally, it contains numerous contradictions, like differing genealogies for Jesus in Matthew and Luke, and conflicting resurrection accounts across the Gospels, including who visited the tomb and what they saw. The dismissal of scholars like Bart Ehrman further reveals the lack of engagement with these issues. Ehrman's work doesn't rely on heavy interpretation. It simply lays out textual inconsistencies, historical inaccuracies, and evidence of editing in the Bible. Even if you disagree with some of his conclusions, his findings are based on decades of research and rigorous analysis. The belief in biblical inerrancy, that the Bible is free from error, is held by a minority of Christians, primarily among fundamentalists. Most theists, including many biblical scholars, accept that the Bible reflects the limitations of its human authors, who lived in specific historical and cultural contexts. This argument seems to come from the position of believing the Bible is true because one already believes it's true, a form of circular reasoning. Honest engagement requires addressing the evidence, even if it challenges those deeply held beliefs. For theists, faith can still be meaningful without denying or ignoring the facts.
Do you realize that the biggest evidence for Noah's flood is that the entire world is covered in sedimentary layers? Sedimentary layers are laid down by water, and they're all filled with millions of dead things. And there's sea creatures in every level of the sedimentary layers, from top to bottom. You do realize that the whole earth is literally evidence for the global flood, right?
So this idea that sedimentary layers are evidence of Noah's flood has been thoroughly debunked by multiple fields of science. Aaron Ra has an excellent playlist about this. Go to his channel if you want to see some more of this stuff in depth, but I'm going to talk about it very briefly. Sedimentary layers formed over millions of years through processes like erosion, deposition, and lithification, not a single catastrophic flood. The fossil record shows an ordered progression of life over time. If a global flood had occurred, we'd expect to see a chaotic mix of all species in the same layers, which we do not. The presence of marine fossils on mountains is explained by the movement of tectonic plates, which uplift ancient seabeds over millions of years. Yes, sedimentary rock is found all over the Earth, but it's a type of rock, not evidence for a global flood. These rocks form under various conditions, rivers, lakes, oceans, and even deserts over vast stretches of time. The layers differ in composition, fossil content, and formation processes, which is completely inconsistent with the idea of a single flood event. As for fossils on mountains, as I touched on before, the explanation lies in plate tectonics, not a flood. For example, the Himalayas were formed by the collision of the Indian and Eurasian plates, lifting ancient seabeds into some of the highest peaks on Earth. This natural process accounts for marine fossils on mountaintops without invoking a global flood. The Noah's flood story may hold symbolic or religious significance, but it's not supported by geology, paleontology, or any other field of science.
Okay, you do understand that atheism is the only worldview that can never be proven true under any circumstance.
This one gets a little frustrating. He very clearly oversimplifies atheism and misunderstands the concept of falsifiability. First, let me distinguish between two types of atheism. Hard atheism is the assertion that no gods exist. This could potentially be unfalsifiable depending on how God is defined. If a deity is defined in vague and non-empirical terms, it becomes impossible to test or disprove scientifically. Soft atheism is the lack of belief in gods. This doesn't require proof or falsifiability. It's simply a position based on the absence of evidence for God claims. So even if atheism, or certain forms of it, is unfalsifiable, so what? Falsifiability is a useful criterion in science, but it doesn't automatically validate or invalidate a worldview. Many theistic claims, such as the existence of a God who operates outside of space and time, are also unfalsifiable. By his own logic, his worldview faces the same problem. Here he's not providing an argument against atheism or in favor of theism. He's just pointing out the limitation that applies to many metaphysical claims. Instead of focusing on unfalsifiability, I posit that meaningful discussions should address the evidence and reasoning behind both positions.
You do realize that there is a God, and his name is Jesus, right? That he died on the cross for all of our sins, because he loves you, and he wants us all to be saved and to be in heaven with him. Do you realize that, right?
This is more preaching than an argument, and none of it is shown to be true. How did he determine that a God exists? How did he know that this God is specifically Mr. Jesus? And how did he know what this God wants? Without evidence or reasoning to support these claims, they amount to a declaration of faith rather than a discussion. Interestingly, the Bible itself includes passages that suggest humans cannot fully know the mind of God. And Romans 11:34 specifically says, "For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor?" Yet here he's claiming to know exactly what this God loves, desires, and has done. How does he reconcile this apparent contradiction? Faith is personal, but when someone makes objective claims about reality, such as the existence of a specific God, they bear the burden of proof to support these claims. Without that, this isn't an argument, but simply preaching to those who already share the belief. And that's the end of his video. So there were a bit too many claims here to simply summarize, so instead, I'm going to jump right to the next part. I give this video a perfect 10 facepalmy Mr. Jesuses out of 10 for a bunch of reasons. First, there are blatant factual errors. There's claims about evolution, transitional fossils, and abiogenesis are all demonstrably false and betray a lack of understanding of even basic scientific principles. He misrepresented Louis Pasteur's work, and the geological evidence for sedimentary layers is tremendously distorted. He also had a number of strawman arguments. He repeatedly characterized atheism as relying on lies, excuses, and aliens, and arguments like panspermia, and fails to address the actual atheist position. Then there are appeals to emotion and circular reasoning. Statements like, "You do realize there's a God and his name is Mr. Jesus," provide no evidence and rely entirely on emotional appeal, and his dismissive and ad hominem tone calling atheism a big fat lie and attacking critics of the Bible dismisses genuine discourse in favor of insult. Finally, for this, he neglected opposing evidence. He ignores or dismisses the overwhelming evidence for evolution, the natural origin of life, and the historical critical approach to the Bible, instead substituting repetition of false claims. But what do you think? Do you think Mr. Indoctrination here presented some great Christian arguments against atheism? Or do you think these arguments atheists can't refute are actually easily refuted? Let me know in the comments below. If you think I went hog wild on these arguments, hit that like button to join me, whatever that means. Though you can create something, as long as that something is more of my content, by hitting that subscribe button to make it appear seemingly out of nothing on your YouTube's page. Though I need to give an extra special thanks to my patrons, especially Calamitous Anima and Sora, who are the goalposts that help keep my channel firmly planted. Though if you want to know the mind of Dark, you can join them for as low as a single $1 a month at patreon.com/darkofalltrades. Thank you, every single one of you. Your ongoing support throughout my career on the YouTubes is inspiring. Even when we have minor disagreements, my talks with you in the Discord, on the YouTube channel comments, or even my email all help me become a better critical thinker and content creator. Thank you. I take all of you seriously. And as always, keep learning.